We have two panels this afternoon. Then we'll take a short break, actually about a 2-hour break, starting at 4 o'clock, and we will reconvene at 6 o'clock for dinner, and then at 6:30 p.m. we'll have our second keynote address of the day from Yuval Levine. So now it's my pleasure to welcome back to Arizona State University the moderator of this next panel, Eric Felten, who studied philosophy here at Arizona State University, summa cum laude from ASU. There was electricity here, I understand, back in the days, but he says it was a very different institution then than it is now. So I'll introduce Eric, and then he will in turn introduce the panelists. Eric Felten is a journalist and author. He has been a columnist for the Wall Street Journal and the Washington Examiner, and for several years he was the managing editor of the Weekly Standard. He's written a range of books on different topics. One, Loyalty, the Vexing Virtue. Another, How's Your Drink? And a third, The Ruling Class Inside the Imperial Congress. After his studies in philosophy here at ASU, he studied public administration at Harvard, including studying game theory with Thomas Schelling, and political philosophy with both John Rawls and Harvey Mansfield. So please join me in welcoming our next panel on, this is the historical panel, right? So I got to get my title right. Is political polarization in 2019 really worse than it has ever been?
Thank you, Paul. Thank you. So one of the things that Harvey Mansfield was talking about in the previous panel was that politics is an argument, and I might give a variation on that and say that politics is often and usually a contest. So in that context, what does civility mean? Is it to celebrate discourse that's just nice, or is it to celebrate discourse that succeeds in an argument without going beyond certain boundaries? When we think of competition, I'm reminded of my son who plays basketball. Coming off the court, one of his friends after practice, and his friend had a t-shirt on that said, "Make baskets, not friends." And the idea there was that if you were committed to the competition, you might be sportsmanlike and you might be friendly, but you weren't worried about making friends with the people you were competing against. There's an old football coach motto, "Show me a good loser and I'll show you a loser." And we wonder if it's possible to have an argument without a discourse without realizing that there may be a winner or a loser to the argument, and in fact that the discourse to some extent is going to be motivated by winning the argument, to winning the contest, the political contest, and that this is not necessarily a bad thing. The question is that when we think about arguments, we often put them in terms of things like, rough and tumble terms, like a knockdown argument. And what this panel is going to talk about to some extent is when the metaphorical knockdown argument becomes a literal knockdown argument. And those are two different things altogether. To talk a little bit about the amount of political polarization and the different forms that it takes currently, I might just note a couple of items that were in the news just this week. Both of these items involve arrests and accusations, but no one has yet been convicted, so I'll discuss this with the presumption of innocence in all cases. But item number one, we have federal prosecutors said this week that a U.S. Coast Guard officer was plotting to, quote, murder innocent civilians on a scale rarely seen in this country, which is some kind of scale, actually. Christopher Paul Hassan is accused of planning a politically motivated killing spree. According to prosecutors, Hassan collected a small arsenal of and compiled a list of prominent Democratic congressional leaders, activists, political organizations, and MSNBC and CNN media personalities. Item number 2, Chicago police arrested a TV actor for falsely claiming he had been attacked by a pair of red-hatted racists. Jussie Smollett had told police the men poured bleach on him, put a noose around his neck, and finally ran off shouting, "This is MAGA country." Prosecutors say the actor staged the whole thing, even providing the men with the money to buy the red hat. So here we have 2 examples of the political polarization of the moment. If these accusations prove to be true, there's 1, someone with enough hatred of political opponents to plan to kill them, and 2, someone taking advantage of the climate of polarization to try to grab attention and praise by faking being the victim of political violence. Kind of flip sides of the coin. Are these sorts of incidents something new, or do they have abundant historical antecedents? And if so, which was worse, the polarization of the past or the modern variety? That's what we hope to sort out with the help of the distinguished members of this panel, which include one of the most knowledgeable experts on modern American politics, a professor with a unique and extensive expertise in the history of political violence in the United States, and a journalist and historian who has written as much about the founders as he has about the current crowd in Washington. Let me introduce them properly. Norman Ornstein is a resident scholar at the American Enterprise Institute and a columnist and contributing editor for The Atlantic. He's also chairman of the Campaign Legal Center. He's been for both CBS and BBC, their election night commentator. He helped create the Continuity of Government Commission. And I've got a bone to pick with you on that one, Norm, because I used to be at Voice of America, and we had all sorts of work that we had to do to meet the requirements of the Continuity of Government Commission, which meant setting up remote locations, and it happily was never used. It just took a lot of time.
That's why you're here today.
And that's why I'm here today. He played a major role in Senate committee reform, and also was involved in creating McCain-Feingold campaign finance law. Among his many books are The Broken Branch, How Congress is Failing America and How to Get It Back on Track, a book labeled by The Economist a classic. And he's author of It's Even Worse Than It Looks, How the American Constitutional System Collided with the New Politics of Extremism, also with Thomas Mann. And the update of that book was It's Even Worse Than It Was, and that was published. So we see a trajectory here, and yet Norm is one of the most genial and happy-going people that there is, so something really must be happening to get Norm to describe the present in such terms. Norm Ornstein was named one of the 100 top global thinkers by Foreign Policy magazine, and he's going to talk with us about the nature and extent of political conflict now on display in Washington and across the country. Then we're going to hear about overwrought political passions of the past, particularly those of the 1790s and the 1850s, from Joanne Freeman. She's professor of history and American studies at Yale University and co-host of the history podcast Backstory. Freeman is a leading expert on early national American politics and culture. She's author of the award-winning Affairs of Honor, National Politics in the New Republic, and editor of Alexander Hamilton Writings and The Essential Hamilton, which does not, however, as far as I know, include the Broadway libretto. But Freeman is best known for her expertise in dirty politics, an interest that has made her work particularly relevant in recent years. Her most recent book, The Field of Blood, Violence in Congress and the Road to Civil War, is a finalist to the Lincoln Prize and one of the New York Times top 100 books for 2018. One of the interesting things that I took away from reading Joanne's excellent book is that there has been a class consciousness between the House and the Senate for a very long time, and even in matters of political violence. So if you got into a fight with somebody on the House floor in the 1850s, it would be settled with bare knuckles or Bowie knives. The Senate, however, you would leave the chamber, you would go out to the countryside and have a proper duel. So the Senate always did things with a little more style, I'd say. And then to compare and contrast the polarization of today with that besetting the Republic from its founding, we'll turn to Jay Cost. Jay Cost is a visiting scholar at the American Enterprise Institute and teaches social studies at Portersville Christian School in Pennsylvania. He's the author of The Price of Greatness, Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and the Creation of American Oligarchy. He's currently writing a biography of James Madison, and he's written extensively for such publications as The Weekly Standard, National Review, and Real Clear Politics. He received his PhD in political science from the University of Chicago. Let's get things started by welcoming Norm Ornstein to the podium, or rather to the microphone at the table.
Thanks so much, Eric, and I'm really delighted to be here and to be on this terrific panel. I do want to congratulate you all to start with on your courage for coming out today. I don't mean the rain, I mean risking your lives in this state of national emergency to venture out and be here. And I hope that all of you will demonstrate your deeper patriotism by playing golf tomorrow after the conference and again on Sunday, showing your solidarity with the White House. The title of this panel is Political Polarization, Is It Worse in 2019 Than It Has Ever Been? And I'm actually reminded I wrote an article in Foreign Policy magazine about the 111th Congress, which the editors titled Worst Period, Congress Period, Ever Period. And I got a great deal of feedback. Oh, come on, are you telling me it's worse than the Congresses before the Civil War? And I would say, no, I wouldn't tell you that at all. Isn't it comforting to be compared to the Congresses in the period leading up to the Civil War? And of course, the reality is that as Joanne's wonderful book demonstrates, and we know so much through history, divisions in American politics that can lead to violence, divisions in the society that flow from it that can lead even to a civil war are not new. And you can certainly make a case that the period that we had in the post-World War II era, where the parties did not have deep ideological distinctions in many ways, where there was some significant overlap, where I used to, when I first started to teach about Congress in the late 60s and early 70s, I would say to my students, imagine if we took all the members of Congress and took them about 1.5 miles on buses due east of the Capitol to what used to be our football stadium, RFK, and told them to go down on the field and place themselves where their worldview, their general orientation would make them feel most comfortable. And we went up into the press box, we would look down on a visual representation of the bell curve of a normal distribution. The vast majority of members congregated somewhere near the midfield area and a lot of admixture between the parties. And that was a reality, I think, through much of that period, really even going back to the 30s and 40s. But that was not typical of what we had throughout the course of American history. And of course, it is dramatically different now. And the last time I used this analogy for the Congress that preceded this one, I said to groups that if we took the then current Congress and performed the same exercise, repainting the lines on the football field at RFK, now defunct, and went up to the press box, we would see a midfield area fairly barren, and a few members congregated on either side, not far from the 40-yard lines, moving down on one side to a lot of people around the 30, and then the 20, moving down to a smaller number. And on the other side of the field, you'd have to go all the way down to about the 10-yard line, a whole lot of people behind the goalpost, and not a few floating in the Anacostia River nearby. But that's very different than what we have been used to in our politics until we reach this point. Now, having said that, there's a polarization that has taken place, but you can still make policy and operate in a functional fashion when there is polarization. I was just out doing a lecture on health policy, and I used the example that I frequently do of the long-time odd couple friendship and partnership over decades between Ted Kennedy and Orrin Hatch. Kennedy anchoring the liberal side of his party, and Hatch for a long time anchoring the conservative side of his. And the Children's Health Insurance Program and the Orphan Drug Program, among other things, were products of a partnership where they agreed on a common problem, found some common ground, and then horse traded back and forth to actually make something happen and provided some protection against destructive amendments that might come from either side. But as I've argued in these various books, and it goes from the broken branch to it's even worse than it looks to it's even worse than it was, and I'm thinking about Run for Your Lives for the next one. What's happened is that over really evolving, I would argue, since January 3rd of 1979, we have moved much more from polarization to tribalism, and there is a very significant difference. At least in the political realm with political actors, you can be polarized and work with people on the other side because they're honorable people. They just have misguided views, but we know there are problems and we can find ways to make things work. It's tribal when you believe that they're evil and are trying to destroy your fundamental way of life. And I believe that this started in Washington and metastasized out to many states and then to the public as a whole. And that is not the only challenge that we face in our political world. And I'll talk about a broader one in a bit, but it is a very significant one. Now, I'm not going to spend a lot of time going into the history of this, but I think I was present close to the creation in a series of dinners that we did when I first went to the American Enterprise Institute with members of the class of 1978 coming into Congress. And the first project that Tom Mann and I decided we would do is get a group of the new members coming in and do a series of off-the-record dinners with them through the course of their first term in Congress. And we had, it was an off year, but there was quite a remarkable collection of people. And among the ones we selected were Newt Gingrich, Dick Cheney, and Geraldine Ferraro. And Newt dominated a discussion with a group of very high-powered people because he came in with a firmly set strategy and tactics for how he was going to break the stranglehold that Democrats had on majorities in the House of Representatives, which at that point was 24 years and went to 40. And it was, as he made clear, deliberate tribalization of our politics, using the ethics process and goading the majority, which was, to be sure, fat, arrogant, condescending to the minority, not a little bit corrupt, and it wasn't difficult to prod them into overreacting, but working with language and in other ways to try and radicalize his own party and pit them against the other side and turn it into the fundamental equivalent of a parliamentary minority while he was in the process of doing so. And he had some significant success, although it took him 16 years. Now, that was accompanied by, a short while later, the rise of tribal media. And I think you could argue that a combination of things that included the repeal of the Fairness Doctrine in 1987, which motivated Rush Limbaugh, who had been a noontime obscure radio talk show host in Sacramento, California, to move to New York and try and go national. And then a pay raise at a time of some populist uprising in 1988-89, ironically endorsed not just by the outgoing president Ronald Reagan and the incoming one George Herbert Walker Bush and all the congressional leaders and all the elites in the society, even by Newt Gingrich, but that triggered this fierce public reaction as there was a recommendation to increase the pay of members of Congress, judges, and top executives by 25%. The argument being that they hadn't had an increase in a decade, to a public that was felt lucky if they could get a 1% cost of living adjustment in a year, created a firestorm, and that created an opening for tribal talk radio and a business model that obviously extended beyond that and then has been amplified even more with social media emerging. Now, I think another element of what happened here is what I would see as the beginning of a war on science and facts, which has contributed to the polarized and tribal environment that was triggered in part by one of Newt's first actions, which was to eliminate the Office of Technology Assessment in Congress, which provided scientific expertise into a whole series of debates, but that scientific expertise was leading in directions and policy that he and his colleagues didn't like very much, and we've seen that continue and extend. And then one other factor that I would just mention, which I saw over the almost 5 decades that I've been immersed in this process, which was the emergence of the permanent campaign. When I first came to Washington, politics had seasons. There was a season of campaigning that was roughly 6 months out of every 2 years, and then a season of governing. And there really were separations there. And I would see the pollsters and the political consultants who would come in for 6 months and then they'd fade away and go off and do other things. And as time went by, they weren't fading away. And when I would go to meetings, and I did for both parties, retreats of different groups, leadership groups, and I'd come as a sort of independent observer and commentator, and you'd have a couple of dozen members sitting at a table, and there would be the staff sitting around behind them. And gradually the staff moved from being the legislative and administrative leaders in their staffs to the pollsters and the consultants. Those were the ones who determined what issues they would talk about and how they would frame those issues and what they would do. And in a permanent campaign, triggered in part as well by the fact that once Newt moved to success, bringing his tribe out of 40 years of wandering in the desert of the minority to the promised land of the majority in 1994, we have had a succession of close elections where the majorities could change hands anytime. And that meant that the attitudes of members changed. And it went from governing through a process that my late mentor and friend Daniel Patrick Moynihan used to talk about all the time, where we don't make significant social policy in this country without getting broad leadership consensus through debate and deliberation, to one where if you brought that broad leadership consensus and did something, it might give traction to the other side. They could get benefits from it, and that would lessen your chance of gaining those extra seats to move into the majority, or lessen your chance of keeping your majority because they would look better along the way. And so working with the other side began to be tantamount to sleeping with the enemy. And except for issues that moved to a lower level, we really did begin to see major policies move through with few, if any, votes from people in the minority, and a manipulation of rules and processes to make sure that if you had a slender majority, you could make those things happen. All of that occurring, of course, as the parties did become more ideologically homogeneous and separated in terms of worldview a little bit more as well. Then, as I said, that's begun to metastasize out, and we know all kinds of ways in which we can look at how the public views parties now, including the now famous set of statistics from the Gallup poll about a reality that people now would be more upset if a child of theirs married somebody from the other party than from another race or religion. Very different from what it was when Gallup first asked the question in 1960. Now, you can obviously look back at times when we had deep divisions. What makes this different, and what makes me concerned about where we're heading with all of this? And I'll mention just a few things. I think it is different in part because of the nature of tribal and social media, and the degree to which things can be amplified, and the degree to which we can move from having what I think the framers saw as essential to the process that was set up, a Congress, not a parliament, one where you would have people come together, and the essence, as people reflected and saw what others who had very different life experiences and represented different kinds of people, where they were coming from, organically through debate and deliberation, you'd be able to reach, if not a consensus, at least a policy outcome where those who felt that they lost had their views brought to play and they'd gotten a fair hearing, and organically you could find something that was a little bit better. But it all started with the belief that you would have a common set of facts and a consensus on whether problems existed, even if there were differences about directions in which you might move to resolve those problems. And it's becoming harder and harder to make that happen. At the same time, we are seeing greater divisions in the parties than we would have just with ideas alone. Just to pick one example now, if you take a look at the classes of members of Democrats and Republicans in Congress right now, you are looking at two different universes. The new House of Representatives majority has 40% of its membership who are women. The minority has 6.5% who are women. There is a dramatic difference in terms of whether there are people of color on one side or the other, and those divisions that reflect the nature of recruitment to office and a whole series of other factors are going to create increasing divisions, and we see those divisions play out in ways that we've had before but that are growing as well. We've had a gender gap, obviously, in votes for a very long time. That gap is widening significantly. We've had a marriage gap that is also widening, a religiosity gap, and now we're getting a sharp both education and urban-rural gap that are greater than we've had. And it's creating a greater sense that people on the other side of the political aisle are just different people than we are. And those divisions, if you think about political tribalism and overlay that onto the racial and ethnic divisions that we've had through history, and have those amplified rather than damped down, that's not good. Finally, just a point on the structural challenges we face. In 2000, or by 2040, 70% of Americans will live in 15 of our 50 states. 50% of Americans will live in 8 states. That means that the Electoral College is going to be increasingly skewed away from the most populous states, and it means that 30% of Americans will elect 70 of the 100 senators. They will have the ability to override vetoes, to enact any policies that they want, and they are not going to be broadly representative of the diversity of the country or the economic dynamism of the country. We had in the first 44 elections from 1824 through 1996, arguably one where you could say with clarity that the winner of the presidency lost the popular vote. 2 out of the last 5, and there will be more of those. And each time it happens, there is a growing sense of illegitimacy in the outcome. When 70 senators who represent populations that are not as diverse and not as economically strong begin to make decisions that take from the larger share of the population to move to other places, there's going to be a sense of illegitimacy in the outcomes that the people have not spoken. And the way in which the tribal divisions have played out, including with the tribalization of the courts, there will be a growing sense, I believe, that people whose ideas or party were rejected decades ago are having their policies continued by those who they were able to put in place for a lifetime. All of that is going to create an enormous challenge, a challenge that moves way beyond whatever Donald Trump provides for us for decades to come. And if we don't deal with it, then future historians, if there are any, are going to be writing about this period the way Joanne wrote about the ones that she's specialized in.
Let me start by saying thank you for inviting me here as a historian to take part in this political discussion. As Norm suggested, this panel is essentially asking a question, which is now the worst that it's ever been? And my short answer as a historian is no. But I will say more than that. As someone who really specializes in political violence of various sorts, I can take a very long view of this, and I can say that there are certainly polarization, I suppose you could say, is a spectrum, and there have been a lot of different kinds of moments of polarization across American history. But there are also moments, I think, when it's extreme, and we are obviously in one now. I would say that the late 1790s was one, I would say that the 1850s was one, and I would say that the 1960s was one. And I would say that all of those moments of extreme polarization share a couple things in common, and I'm going to come back to this idea at the end. In both instances, there is this sort of tribalistic sense that the other side is un-American, that they have to be defeated because if they're allowed to exist, then they mean the destruction of the nation. In all of those moments, the 1790s, the 1850s, the 1960s, there was a sense, I think, a shared sense that this was a moment of particularly high stakes, that there was some kind of fundamental decision about the nation's course being determined. So in the 1790s, they were really talking about how small d democratic national politics would be. And that's essentially what was pulling the nation apart. There were other factors feeding into it, but Federalists versus Republicans, that was a huge part of that battle. I'm going to come back in a moment to the 1850s, but obviously slavery was the enormous issue that was dividing the nation at that particular moment. And in the 1960s, you could say civil rights. All of those things represented moments of change that I think Americans recognized as such. There was an immediacy to them. There was a sense that permanent change might be made at that moment. And there was a sense that the system might or might not be able to encompass that moment. There was people didn't necessarily have faith that what was playing out in all of those moments somehow could be bound in or properly managed by the political system. So what I want to do is look at one of those moments and how it played out, partly because I think looking at that in the past will shed some interesting light on the present, and also because I think there are some really striking similarities, particularly with some of the logistics in all of these moments, the bundle of factors, I think, that come together and that help to fuel this kind of extreme polarization, some of which actually are right in line, Norm, with what you were saying. But let's look briefly at really the first half of the 19th century. You could say that that period is bound by two moments of polarization of a sort. So in the 1820s, you have the rise of Jacksonian democracy and Andrew Jackson. You have the first real structured, organized national political parties. And politics fundamentally changes. And when you read the letters and papers and diaries of people who were engaged in the politics of that moment, they can't quite believe the spirit of the thing, for better and worse. Some of them are afraid that it feels almost warlike. They feel actually kind of along the lines, Norm, of what you were saying, that it doesn't seem to stop. When you're in a party, you're in a party, and you like your party, and you hate the other party, and it seems to be ongoing. There was kind of a sea change with the rise of Jacksonian Democrats and real organized party politics. But that kind of polarization was very different from what then came later in that first half of the 19th century. And there are a couple things that make those different kinds of polarizing moments. Now, of course, the second half of that century, and I'm going to talk now specifically about the 1850s, it's the slavery crisis that proves to be the polarizing question that takes things beyond where they were before. So people are shocked and kind of awed and kind of struck at the rise of party politics in the 1820s, but then they come to see that as routine. But what's very different in the 1850s is that now there's a feeling of immediacy in that moment, and not a feeling that we're talking about some new routine. So in the late 1850s, there's an understanding that increasingly, because of the nation's expansion west, every time that a new state is discussed as entering the Union, it raises the question again and again, is this going to be a free state or is this going to be a slave state? Which keeps the slavery issue front and center throughout that period. So it means that it feels like a pressing problem. It's a problem that has to be debated and decided over and over again. it senses, people at the time sense, and I think rightly so, that whatever the answer is to that debate is going to have an enormous permanent impact on the nation. There was certainly a feeling in the 1850s that national institutions of all kinds were failing in their ability to deal with that crisis. So people were no longer trustful that Congress could handle that kind of a crisis. Political parties were splintering, so there wasn't actually really any faith on that level too, that those sorts of national institutions could encompass this crisis. And one particularly striking thing that changed the nature of politics in the 1850s, which actually is right in line with what you were saying, Norm, about social media, technology, a new technology in the 1850s fundamentally changed the nature of politics and hyperventilated the polarization. And by that I mean the telegraph. So the telegraph comes along, and whereas before, in a sense, politics was a slower process, you had politicians able to control their spin somewhat. You had reporters and politicians conferring on what kind of news got out. You had the slow spread of news. When you had the telegraph, you suddenly had something happening in Washington, and 45 minutes later, it would be boomeranging around the country. And that fundamentally changed politics. It meant that you could no longer be in Massachusetts, for example, and murmur something negative and assume that no one else would ever get a hold of that comment, or if they did, it would be down the road in the future. It wouldn't be on the front page of a newspaper. So the telegraph, as a form of technology changing communication, really, really changed the nature of polarization. And I think if you think of politics as one big conversation between politicians and the public who put them there or take them out, then any kind of technology that changes that conversation has the potential to inflict an enormous amount of change. So I do think, interestingly, and in ways that certainly never occurred to me when I started working on the book that has this at the heart of it, social media and the telegraph, in a sense, had that same kind of sea change of dynamic, so that the nature of politics, the nature of debate, the nature of conversation, the nature of discourse, and the ability of politicians to steer that conversation fundamentally changed. It makes sense that those are moments when things get upset and overturned, and it makes sense that there's a sense that you don't know how that moment's going to play out. On the one hand, you think from a sort of democratic sensibility, like, okay, like, kind of like we were discussing earlier, right? Social media, this is good because Americans can talk to each other and information is spreading. The same thing with the telegraph. You know, this is excellent. It will connect the country in all kinds of ways that it hasn't been connected before. And to some degree that's true, and then to some degree it isn't. To some degree, transparency ended up, and has sometimes in this moment ended up being problematic. And in part, again, as was said earlier, to some degree that has to do with emotion. That has to do with the fact that when you're increasing the speed at which this conversation and news is spreading, and it's a moment like I'm talking about in those key sort of politicized moments, polarized moments, that people think there's some kind of permanent drastic change that's going to be put into place, there is high emotion. There's going to be high emotion, and if it feels like a do or die, us or them shift, it makes perfect sense that the response is going to be just as the response is in all of those moments. I can't resist sharing with you, go all the way back to the 1790s, just my favorite example of 1790s campaign propaganda, just to give you a sense of some of the extremism that we're feeling now is definitely not new. So this is from the election of 1800, which was insanely polarized. You had the Federalists thinking the Republicans were going to overturn the Republic, the Republicans thinking the Federalists were going to create a monarchy and destroy the Republic. Extreme politics, nasty charges, character assassination, all kinds of nastiness, people marching in the street, violence. It was a bad period. And my favorite piece of campaign propaganda was for pro-John Adams, anti-Thomas Jefferson. And it actually was sort of a broadside that got posted in public places. And it had a picture of each man, and next to Adams, it said, John Adams for president, and then it said, or, and then next to Jefferson, it said, Jefferson and no God. the charge was, he's an atheist, and if he becomes president, there will be no God. Religion will be defeated. So that's 1800. So on the one hand, I suppose what I'm saying is, clearly there are moments when there's a logic to what we're experiencing now. And some of that logic is systemic, so some of that has to do with changes that are happening, some of them technological, some of them otherwise, in the nature of politics that set things up to go in a certain direction. And some of them are more event-oriented, when something very particular happens and changes the nature of politics and sort of, what's the word I'm looking for? Highlights, intensifies to an extreme degree what already has been set in motion. I'm not going to be able to offer you brilliant words of wisdom as far as fixing the problem. I do hope that after the 2 days that we have of talking here, that we'll at least come up with some vague idea of directions to move in. But what I at least will say is, these moments have happened before. On the one hand, that's reassuring. On the other hand, all of those moments are different. All of those moments, there is something in that moment, something distinctive about that moment that is capturing people in a different way at a moment when the culture is different. And so we can't equate the present with the past and say, well, because this happened last time, we should do X this time. But we certainly can understand the bundle of things that I think add up together to intensify the political climate in this way. Thank you.
Thank you, Eric. Thank you, Paul, for having me here. It's a privilege to be here, despite the rain. It's remarkably similar to the rain in western Pennsylvania right now, so I'm sorry for bringing it with me. When I was talking to Eric in the weeks before this panel began, he suggested maybe as a kickoff to share one of my favorite anecdotes from the founding period, which there's one that is really far and above all the others. This is a letter that Thomas Jefferson wrote to James Madison in December 1784. So this was after Madison had finished his 4-year stint in the Continental Congress, mostly frustration. Now he was back in the state government, in the state legislature, the House of Delegates in Richmond, and they were trying to fix the Virginia Constitution, which Madison himself had been a minor part of in passing, but now they wanted to fix it. And standing in their way was the formidable Patrick Henry, who could sell a refrigerator to an Eskimo. That's how gifted he was as a rhetorician. And Jefferson and Madison were no match for him. And Jefferson wrote to Madison that while Mr. Henry lives, another bad constitution would be formed and saddled forever on us. What we have to do, I think, is devoutly to pray for his death. Is what Jefferson, and he had the good sense, by the way, to write that part in cipher, so in case it was captured in the mail. So my sort of broad question, or that I'm asking, or at least been charged with pondering, is the extent to which polarization and mutual political hatred of 2019 is similar to that which occurred in the 1790s, in really the first decade of actual American politics. I mean, we had politics before that, but the politics was conditioned by a government that was fundamentally defective and was simply not up to the exigencies of the public crises. So now we had finally created this government. We created this structure of a government, and now we have to use it to, form policies to meet the exigencies of the moment, right? And I think there are similarities and differences. And I'll just sort of run through them and give you sort of my take on where things stand. I think one similarity that's worth mentioning is the extremism of the 1790s. Is that, if anything, I think you could argue that there was more extremism in the 1790s. That, Citizen Genet, for instance, who was appointed minister to the United States by revolutionary France, came over and was basically trying to form a paramilitary army to basically go back to France and fight. And there were these democratic clubs, as they were known, being formed. It's sort of, the backdrop here being the French Revolution and the dangers of the French Revolution juxtaposed to the very conservative, thoroughly American Revolution. Right, is that the sort of violence and bloodshed that had already come to France might be brought by these radicals, which motivated the Sedition Act of 1798. I mean, I don't want to, defend the Sedition Act of 1798, except that I will say that, they did have legitimate concerns about sedition. I mean, we can look back on the Sedition Act of 1798 and say, well, they were just wrong, because we know that a free press is good for liberty. But that's only because we've had 220 years of a free press since then that's generally been good for liberty. They were in uncharted waters there, and they were legitimately scared about the Federalists were legitimately scared about godless Jacobins, right, coming to the United States and bringing the kind of bloodshed that had been extant in Paris. So that is, I think, a similarity. If anything, I would say that the 1790s were probably worse in that regard. Another similarity is the mutual hatred that the two sides in the 1790s had for each other and had developed for each other, and a conviction that the opposition was not just opposed to you on matters of policy, whatever was being debated, but had actually was opposed to the revolution and was opposed to Republican government. I think a great example of that would be the debate in 1793 that Madison and Hamilton had through a series of anonymous pamphlets over Washington's neutrality proclamation, which when you read Washington's neutrality proclamation, you'll notice he doesn't actually use the word neutrality. But it's really just a statement of, hey, we're not taking a side. Not to say that we won't take a side, but it is just sort of a way to say we're not taking a side, and I, the president, expect everybody in overseas and on the high seas to act accordingly, right? But Hamilton and Madison launch at each other in a series of essays, and Madison goes so far, and this is, I think, as public as he ever got, to accusing Hamilton of being a monarchist, because in Hamilton's Pacificus essays, he has a very broad interpretation of the executive power in terms of foreign policy making. And Madison's Helvidius essays are not as good. They're very labored in their writing, not as inspired as his Federalist essays. But Madison at one point makes a point that, the sort of power that Hamilton is talking about for an executive to wield, the only safe repository of such power would be a hereditary monarch. So if Hamilton is willing, the ends of a hereditary monarchy, then the means can't be far behind, right? Which is another way of saying Hamilton's a monarchist. Right, so this sort of, in other words, Hamilton is an enemy of the revolution. Right, so this sort of idea that my side stands for the good, the true, the right, the American, their side stands for the ugly, the wrong, the foreign, and I think both sides today do that as well. I think another similarity, an organizational one, is the disorganization of politics, actually. And as Jonathan mentioned in his keynote address this morning, that we have these strong partisans but weak parties. We don't have strong organizations to take public opinion and to rechannel it and to elevate it, which is a function that the parties actually were originally intended to serve. Now, in the 1790s, the problem was that, prior to 1789, we didn't have a government for which parties could reasonably fight each other over in the first place. So we had to, after we invented the government, they had to go on and invent the parties. But I think we have a similar problem now where we have all this emotion and this energy, and it doesn't really have anywhere to go, or at least it doesn't go, it's not... it is not intentionally directed into channels that make it useful for the public good. And I think that this is a problem that we have now that existed then as well. Another similarity is, if any of you have ever been on, YouTube, the old saying, don't read the comments, right? I mean, because, anonymous comments are awful. Right? And the reason why is because they're anonymous. People can say whatever's on their mind, and they don't have to worry about their own reputation being embroiled in the actual, nobody can go back and say, well, you're a jerk for saying that to me, because they don't know who you are. So it's really a way for people to just indulge in their most nasty impulses. And anonymous pamphleteering was very common in the 1780s and 1790s. There were advantages to that. One of the advantages was that somebody like Madison could write a series of anonymous essays, right? Publius, they didn't know who Publius was, so the arguments had to rise or fall on their own, right? Madison and Hamilton were not using their reputations in the Federalist essays because the essays were anonymous. But the downside to that is that, in the Helvidius Pacificus debate, Madison could, use the Neutrality Proclamation as an opportunity to accuse the Secretary of Treasury of being a monarchist, right? And I think that there's a overlap there, this sort of anonymous nature of social media and the comments section and things like that really ends up kind of poisoning the discourse. So those are ways that there are similarities, but I think that the differences are probably more substantial. I want to talk about a couple of them in detail. The biggest one I would say is the diversity of our body politic today rather than in the 1790s. It's interesting that, if anybody is going to read a Federalist paper, they're probably going to read Federalist 10. Or they're probably going to read Federalist 51. But if you read 51, Madison actually loops it back around to 10 as well. So, but that's interesting that it's 10 and not 11, because in 11 Hamilton makes this argument that no, if we form a national union with a national economic marketplace and we start trading with each other, our differences will disappear. Right? And he goes on in Federalist 12 and says, sort of a prelude to what he does as Secretary of the Treasury. What we really need to do is get the currency together, right? Well, why 10 and 51, which is about divisions and disagreements, than 11 and 12, which is about coordination, right? What Hamilton called one great American system was his vision. And I think one of the differences now is that 10, it really speaks to this long post-war era that we're in the midst of, this growing diversity. And you read Federalist 10 now and you think, wow, that really describes the United States of 2019 actually I think kind of much better than it did the United States of 1788, right? We're more diverse on an ethnic basis. We're more diverse on a racial basis. Women were not allowed to vote. The questions about sexuality were firmly held within the closet, weren't even up for discussion. America was overwhelmingly an evangelical Protestant nation, right? We had a small Catholic minority in Maryland, but other than that, across the country, the biggest differences were between, Presbyterians and Episcopalians, right? I mean, they were big differences in the 1770s between Presbyterians and Episcopalians, but very small compared to what we have today in terms of questions about what life means, right? Economic and socioeconomic differences, right? Now we have a highly diversified economy with all sorts of different ways to earn a living, but in the 1790s, more than 90% of the country, they were farming. You could go on and on and on about the differences that existed then and now, or then from now versus then. I think another big difference is the rise and entrenchment of special interest groups. People who have access to the corridors of power that are incommensurate with their voting strength in the larger body politic, that they essentially buy their way into government. And this was something that the founders, the Republicans, Jefferson and Madison especially, were very worried about. And a lot of the things that we take today as being the normal, just routine of politics, they were outraged about. And I think that creates a poisonous situation for both parties, because both parties are seeking, if you read their quadrennial platforms, both of them are making public-spirited arguments, right? This is our public face. This is why anybody, regardless of their age, regardless of where they live, regardless of how much money they make, everybody should vote for the Democrats, say the Democrats. And the Republicans make the same argument. Everybody should vote for the Republicans. Why? Because our side is looking out for the public interest. And that may or may not be true, but it is also the case that both sides have a series of interest groups that are, integral to their political success. and that those interest groups tend to be well taken care of when their side wins. And the opposition looks upon that as hypocrisy, and not wrongly so. But they themselves are hypocrites as well for ignoring their own interest groups, right? So there's this tension here that neither party is really capable of juggling the variety of, basically, you think about the interest groups that they're almost like barnacles that have collected to both political parties and undermined their ability to work for the good of the country. And as an example of that, I would suggest that I know a lot of liberals were outraged at all the special interest giveaways in the Republican tax bill that was passed last year. And if you go back and read the pages of the Weekly Standard in 2010, 2011, you'll see Bill Kristol, Yuval Levin, myself, and others were similarly outraged at all the special interest giveaways that were handed off to Democratic interest groups. Both sides are guilty of this, and it undermines both sides' abilities to make a public-spirited argument, and it reinforces one side's view that the other side is somehow wrong or illegitimate. And another difference, I would say, when I look at the 1790s, I was sort of being critical of Madison in the Helvidius essay in his attack on Hamilton. But when you read that debate very closely, you can see that there are big, big philosophical, ideological questions at stake in that debate. Because the United States of America in the 1790s was in a very vulnerable position. And the country was going to go potentially in many, many different directions. And so even though they would take these cheap shots at each other, there really were competing views, well-formed competing views, not just of public policy, but what this government was supposed to look like in practice, right? They knew that they were in uncharted waters, that this was the first self-government that was really fully going to be exercised on this kind of scale in human history. And there were big stakes, and the major players had well-formed ideas about those stakes and what they thought should happen. And compare that, and again, to Jonathan's keynote this morning, this sort of ideological incoherence, right? Just, like that the phrase that gets kicked around on social media often like as a joke, right? Just vote for Trump to own the libs, right? Like, I sort of feel like this kind of negative partisanship, affective anti-partisanship is not really rooted in big ideas and really major disagreements about the public good. I mean, that's certainly part of it, but I don't think to the extent, whatever you want to say about the politics of the 1790s, it was not trivial in the way that I think our politics today so often is. And so I would say, another difference between then and now is it ended, right? In 1801, which was a very messy election, but then Jefferson, that's the last messy election for more than a quarter century. And I'm really struck, and it's a very striking speech, Jefferson's inaugural address in 1801. I mean, there's this famous line, we're all Republicans, we're all Federalists. But the longer passage, I think, is worth thinking about. But every difference of opinion is not a difference of principle. We have been called different names, brethren. We have been called by different names, brethren of the same principle. We are all Republicans, we're all Federalists. Then he goes on, if there be any among us who would wish to dissolve this union or to change its republican form, let them stand undisturbed as monuments of the safety with which error of opinion may be tolerated when reason is left free to combat it. So Jefferson basically calls for kind of a ceasefire here. And if you look, I mean, Jefferson's presidency and the post-war reevaluation, particularly with the publication and collection of his papers, he's come in for a good deal of criticism, which I think is not unwarranted, but I don't think he gets enough credit for actually kind of following through on a policy level with that. And the fact that compare that to what Norm was saying, right? That this has its origins like 40 years ago, and it's still going on. That's a difference that I think's noteworthy. So when I think about nowadays compared to the 1790s, I think there's more differences than similarities. And I actually think the better corollary might actually be the 1880s. I think the 1880s are a better way to get a handle on where we are, right? The 1880s, there was an explosion of diversity, right? We had just finished the first wave of immigrants. The Germans, the Irish had finished coming, right? We'd already absorbed the Scots-Irish, and now the Italians and the Poles and the Jews and the second wave are beginning to come, right? We have these hardened lines of division between North and South, right? Completely different economies. Now we're beginning to see real religious diversity between Catholics and Protestants, right? We have this very yawning industrial agrarian divide that manifests itself in real policy debates like the question of inflation, right? And we also have these urban-rural disputes where there were real problems in the cities, but also in the countrysides. And oftentimes, the two sides were just lived in completely different universes. And we also had rampant and growing political corruption. And I think that then as now, I think that there was a sense that the bad guys were winning. I think a character like James G. Blaine, right, who basically made a career of giving handouts to the railroads, getting rich and getting away with it. And then, of course, my favorite example of corruption from this period is the Credit Moblier scandal, right, where basically the Union Pacific Railroad creates this dummy organization to basically milk the government, and they hire Oakes Ames to give out basically kickbacks to members of Congress, and he does this. And then the New York Sun blows the lid off of everything, and Congress does an investigation, and basically what happens is that they censure Oakes Ames for selling influence, but they really don't censure anybody for buying influence, right? So, it's sort of, it was gross. And I think that there's this, then as now, there's this sort of sense that, the way things work on a daily basis in Washington is not how they're supposed to work. And there's almost sort of this, almost kind of an existential angst that we've somehow lost sight of the American project. And so I think that period in our history is a better corollary, which I admit is depressing, right? Because we all, everybody is sort of, we all want to be like Teddy Roosevelt, right? Like, Roosevelt's great speech, right? We stand at Armageddon and we do battle for the Lord, right? Like, this is the moment. Well, if it's not the moment, it's like one of the top 5. Right? Like, we got the 1790s, we got the 1850s, we got the 1960s, and we have now, right? But maybe it's not. Maybe that's not what this moment is. Maybe this is just like the 1880s, which is where it's not so much like an apocalypse, but a malaise, right? A malaise driven by rudeness and selfishness, and about which we can do very little, which would be the glass is half empty way to look at it. But I'll end on a high note, and I've always been taken, and I wish it was true, I don't think it is true, but I've always been taken by Bismarck's apocryphal comment, right, that God has a special providence for drunks, fools in the United States of America. And I think if history has really shown us anything in our country's history, it's the United States of America has a unique, special talent to muddle through. And I think that's probably what we'll end up doing here, because that's sort of what we're really good at. And I think, like most ages, this one it's similar to the weather. Ages sort of roll in, and there's very little that we can do about it. We didn't do anything none of us in this room, I don't think, really contributed to this age. Like, we didn't do anything about the weather. But it rolls in, and then it rolls out, and then, sooner or later, this too shall pass. Thank you.
Well, I'm going to take advantage of the opportunity to ask the first question, and then we'll have questions from the floor. In reading Joanne Freeman's book, one of the things that caught my interest was a notion that Southern politicians needed Northern politicians to pursue their agenda in the antebellum years. And yet, whenever the Northern politicians would compromise with their Southern colleagues, the Southerners saw the compromise as a sign of weakness. And so compromise we generally think of as being like key to a civil discourse and a healthy political world. But in that circumstance, the compromise actually fueled what was to come. And I'd like to get maybe just a brief sense from each of you whether you think compromise is what's needed now, or if it's something that in various fights just shows weakness to the opposition.
It's a really interesting question, and I end up thinking about it a lot these days, which I'll explain why in a moment. But it's certainly true that compromise after a certain period, particularly concerning the issue of slavery, was seen as, in a sense, surrender. After a certain point, someone would stand up. Actually, this does happen in 1858, I think. Someone stands up and says, "Will no one offer an olive branch?" And someone else stands up and says, "You've been insulting us and attacking us for weeks. Do you really think that I could stand up and offer an olive branch and not have my constituents laugh in my face, not reelect me? You know, that this is not what my constituents want. You've been behaving in a way that makes it impossible to compromise." So compromise is problematic, and I do think sometimes is a sign of weakness. One of the subtexts of my book, and kind of an alarming one, is that for a long time the dynamic of Congress is that Southerners are bullying Northerners into compliance on a variety of different things, and the Northerners tend to follow the rules and sit down or self-censor or whatever. And that goes on for a while until Northerners get tired of seeing that, and the rise of the anti-slavery Northern Republican Party, men get elected to Congress who are explicitly supposed to fight. So for a time, you have one party or group that's bullying and another one that's following the rules and trying to appease. And after a while, that imbalance doesn't work anymore, and the constituents of the appeasers begin to put people in Congress explicitly not to compromise.
And let me ask Norm, how do you find that balance or the difference between compromise and appeasement?
So one thing before I get to it, Joanne mentioned the telegraph. Years ago I read a book called The Victorian Internet, which I recommend to everybody, which is about the rise of the telegraph, and the parallels are just stunning. And I should also mention that John Rausch, apropos of Jay's comments about special interests, wrote a seminal book about demosclerosis, which was prescient and all should read as well. Now, on to the point. This is tough. Strategically, Republicans used the unwillingness to compromise to win huge victories in 2010 and 2014. It was a conscious effort to operate like a minority parliamentary party, and then whatever got through could be delegitimized. Whatever didn't get through, they were ineffective, and it became a lever for winning power. And that's a powerful argument to have that we're going to see play out, I think, multiple times. But it's not a great way to govern. And the problem that we have is with a system like ours, which is not a parliamentary system, and we don't have a parliamentary culture, where we are going to have divided government more often than not, and where there are other impediments, including in rules, you can really end up with an inability to even begin to discuss appropriately important national problems that need some response from legislatures, federal or state. And we're seeing, I think, that happen more. Now, I would argue that there's another element to this as well. What we've seen in this tribal environment is the independent role of institutions has deteriorated. The House and Senate, and when Hamilton wrote about the danger of, and thought a lot about the danger of an executive who was unprincipled, who had no anchors in the system, who didn't care about the national interest, who was more interested in self-aggrandizement and enrichment, having an independent Congress that provided a check and balance was a core for the protections that we were going to have. Of course, electors were another one that's gone by the boards. When you're tribal, you're more interested in protecting the head of the tribe than you are in playing that independent role. And at the same time, I think we've seen a deterioration of any institutional patriotism that meant that you were concerned about the rules and the nature of how you operated so you could foster debate and compromise. And the norms are as important as the rules there, and the deterioration there is a critical element. And once norms start to deteriorate and we define deviancy down, when there's a change in power, your temptation is not to say, well, they blew up the norms, we're going to go back to them, which means they'll get advantage from their bad actions. It's to blow them up even further. And that's, I think, another major danger we have. One other small point, I just read this morning a terrific review by Michael Kazin, the great historian, in The Nation. I was a little surprised that that's where it was, but of 2 new books about the South and its pivotal role in American history, and the degree to which, when Democrats had the North and the South, we got these compromises all along the way that preserved segregation. But also how Republicans, many of whom push for things like anti-lynching laws, end up giving up because of the power and the relentlessness of those in the South. And I think we have parallels today as well. And the parallels that include, I think, if we look at the 1880s, I would think of Reconstruction as being an era that has eerie similarities to our own in the willingness to pit race against race for political advantage.
Do we have any questions from the floor? Bill?
Yeah, there's been a theme in our proceedings so far, not a consistent theme, but it's been articulated more than once, that we're living through what might be called Seinfeld polarization, polarization about nothing. And to the extent that that idea is out there, I would like to enter a dissent. And it's a dissent that builds on something that Harvey Mansfield said in his remarks, namely that it really is important to take the argument seriously, to take a look at what the substance of the controversy is about. I am no great fan of President Donald Trump, but my hat's off to him because he has developed a set of ideas over the past 3.5 decades about which he's been utterly consistent, which he brought into the White House with him, and which he has used as the basis of his administration. You know, ideas about immigration, about trade, and the appropriate conduct of American foreign policy and the principles on which it ought to be based. These are not trivial issues, and they began by dividing the Republican Party and ended by uniting it. And they have contributed to an extraordinary division of opinion in the country. And I'm not saying that the polarization began there, but I could go through the rise of polarization over the past 40 years and point to really important substantive issues, economic, cultural, and institutional, that I think have led to the present moment. And so this is more of a statement than a question, but it invites a question, and that is, to what extent do the participants in this panel think that this polarization is about something in the way that the polarization in the 1790s was about something, in the 1850s was about something, in the 1890s was about something, in the 1960s was about something? Is this the first polarization that isn't about anything?
Jay, why don't you address that?
Yeah, well, I mean, I certainly think it is about some things. I just think that at this point now, I guess maybe to be precise, is that I think there is a lot of bloodlust in our politics now, where a lot of it is really just want to see the other side punched in the face for the sheer pleasure of it. And I think that the quick turnaround in the Republican Party is evidence of that, if anything else, I would say.
I'd love to address that
Joanne?
because I agree that it is about something. And I think these moments are always about something. I think they're also always emotional, but that doesn't mean that they're not about something substantial. As I suggested earlier, the 1790s really was fundamentally about the role of the people in politics and how democratic this nation would be. The 1850s was the question of slavery. The 1960s was civil rights. And in many ways, what we're talking about now is citizenship. What we're arguing about is who is American And as an American, what kind of rights do you fundamentally have? So I do think that there is something pretty fundamental that people understand right now is being discussed. It's a big issue, and it has that same sense of high stakes as these other issues had at those other such polarized moments.
I would say a couple of things here. One is tribalism has taken what I think were legitimate philosophical differences and muddled them up in a significant way. And that's reflected in a part of what Bill said. A Republican Party that was staunchly for free trade and open immigration, or a much more robust program of immigration, has fallen into line now because dear leader has taken those positions. And that's worked at the elite level and down to the mass level as well. And it suggests that this isn't just about a philosophy or elements of the philosophy, but they're getting muddled up in a different way. And at the same time, if you look at some of the policy areas that we've had these sharp differences on, if you look at the Affordable Care Act and go back to what was the core Republican alternative to the Clinton health care program promoted by Orrin Hatch, Chuck Grassley, and others who became leaders in the anti-Affordable Care Act movement, the similarities are astonishing. If you go back to Nixon creating the Environmental Protection Agency and what was a core concern by Republicans about climate change, with the differences being what role government would play and how you would handle those things, that's now gone in a very different direction. So it is about something, but it's not quite about the way things were in the previous era. And at the same time, I think there's another element looming over this that we haven't even discussed, which is questions of inching towards autocracy or away from some of the fundamental values of democracy, and whether we're going to have a conflict and who's going to be on which side there as we get the press as the enemy of the people, states of emergency, and cults of personality, and child separation, and other things that normally would have united most Americans against that kind of move, that now have us divided on those lines as well. That may be more significant for our future as a republic than some of these other questions.
Yeah, so in my comparison to the 1880s, it was not to suggest that the 1880s were not a time of great trouble. They were a time of tremendous trouble. You had the country was going through a very slow, painful process of deflation that was grinding down the farmers of the Great Plains, who really had no business being out there in the first place. They were farming marginal land that could not, basically earn the income that was required to pay off the loans that they got, and they got the land from the Homestead Act. So basically you have overexpansion of agriculture. They're getting squeezed by railroads, all these problems, right? But I also think that this was a time where the discourse was really not focusing on the problems themselves. And I'm reminded that the election of 1884, Samuel Burchard gives a comment about Romanism, and rebellion that ends up very possibly costing Blaine the election, right? And I think, though, if you read the whole quote, it's actually really interesting. The whole quote is interesting. He says, "We are Republic," he says this, and the problem is that he says this, and Blaine's there, and Blaine doesn't say anything, and it costs him Irish votes in New York City, and Blaine loses to Grover Cleveland. "We are Republicans," Burchard says, "and don't propose to leave our party and identify ourselves with a party whose antecedents have been Romanism, and rebellion. We are loyal to our flag," is what he said, right? And I think that's a good illustration of the problems of, this sort of kind of the discourse in the 1880s, rather than really, getting on to these major socioeconomic problems. The United States was rapidly industrializing and didn't have a government that was capable up to the challenge. Instead, what are they playing to, right? Right? So habits, Romanism, religion, and rebellion. Ancient grievances that are now a quarter century old and only getting older, right? I think that is really, Burchard's comment, I think in a lot of respects really captures our politics today. It's not that we don't have real problems. It's not that there aren't real ideas out there. It's likewise in the 1880s, but that a lot of it is just about about spectacle and mutual animosity in lieu of a real debate about the big things.
We have time maybe just for a very quick phrasing of a question and a quick answer, but we can also, those of you who are in the queue, wait for the next panel as well. Someone want to have a brief question and a brief answer, or Jim, go ahead. Yeah.
Well, it's a little problem with the panel on this question of polarization, which is, I think, being presented generally here as something negative. Yet the two examples that we have from history are arguably not negative. They could be said to be high points of American history. You had polarization, dramatic conflict, and something that in the first instance brought full democracy, in the second instance ended in slavery. So that's the analog. Could you then argue, if you want to use the historical, that polarization is not a negative thing, or at least not completely negative? You have to look at the circumstance, but a positive thing. And this would, of course, have implications for what we do with the current polarization. Do we begin just with this word polarization and assume a priori that it's negative, or do we look at the character of what's actually going on in all the cases?
Anyone want to, just to put that on the table,
Yeah, very briefly. I mean, just sort of in the context of the 1790s, I mean, I think that's sort of, you know, I mentioned Jefferson's inaugural address in 1801, and that this idea that these problems admit of resolution, you know, that they can, that when there are real disagreements. And, you know, what Jefferson did was basically split the difference, combine Hamiltonian economics with Madisonian, you know, politics. The challenge now is that if the polarization is, to what extent is polarization just due to the fact that people are bored and they don't go to church and they don't join civic organizations and they hate the other guy on television and they just want to see that guy punched in the mouth? Right? If that's, I mean, to what extent is that the origin of polarization? You know, a Jefferson-type president is never going to solve that, because that's just bloodlust.
Okay, please join me in thanking Eric Felton and the panel.